Just imagine a world where you're a tech company. You pride yourself on being on the front lines of innovation. You're on the bleeding, cutting edge of technology. All to be bailed out by Sugar Daddy Trump, who just took a 10% stake in the company, the US government did. But don't worry, that's not all the help you need. You also need Jensen Huang, CEO of Nvidia, the largest company in the world by a large margin, who just took a $5 billion stake in Intel. So now you have the US government, one of the most powerful financial entities in the world, and Nvidia, one of the most powerful financial entities in the world, both bailing out a, frankly, failing tech company. What does this mean for Intel and its stock going forward? At first glance, you may even think this is a chart of, I don't know, GameStop, AMC, just any meme stock for that matter. No, this is Intel. What's Trump's plan with all this? How have some of the other companies performed after getting a generous donation or a generous investment from the US government? And what in the world is Nvidia doing? What does Jensen Huang have up his sleeve that he's willing to throw billions of dollars at a company that's basically in the sewer? I mean, I literally had to go back to 1996 to find where Intel was prior to the US government and Nvidia bailout. I mean, we're talking about a stock that hasn't moved in nearly 30 years. You, your mom, your dad, maybe even your grandfather has had this stock in their portfolio for quite some time, and it's certainly not doing them any good. But at the end of the day, we want to know, how can you take advantage of this? And why does this set such a dangerous precedent going forward? Well, we have to start from the beginning. We have to get some context to understand what's going on here. When are some other times that the US government stepped in and bailed somebody out, gave a company a large investment, or took a large stake in a company for whatever reason? As you may have heard, pretty recently, the US government took a major stake in MP Materials. This happened in 2025. These four companies here, automakers, GM and Chrysler, and two massive banks in Bank of America and JP Morgan Chase, they also received some sort of bailout, some sort of government investment in 2008. So definitely a more treacherous period for equities. And then another time, we got to go all the way back to the 1970s when Lockheed Martin, the biggest defense contractor in the United States at the time and today, received a bailout from the government. Now, despite all of these companies receiving money from the government in some way, they weren't all the same. What was the context behind each of these? Well, in 1970, Lockheed Martin was in some major financial distress. They weren't able to pay their bills. And as we mentioned, they were the biggest defense contractor in the United States. So that was spelling disaster for the defense industry at the time. You know what happened? Well, Lockheed Martin became extremely reliant on government contracts. And yes, that's partially just the nature of being a defense company. Defense companies make a majority of their sales to governments, to countries. But the crazy part about this is Lockheed Martin's revenue for the full year of 2024 was about $71 billion. That means 70% of their revenue came from the US government. Would you look at that? The US government, who also bailed them out in the 1970s of a very financially distressed time. So Lockheed will say this was more out of panic, a big fat P, right? Now, what about these, the automakers and the banks? Well, let's look at the banks for an example. JP Morgan, the biggest bank in the entire world, at least by market cap, about $860 billion today, has really become the US government's Robin to their Batman. Typically, when companies or banks, for that matter, are under a lot of financial distress, the government will swoop in, save the day, print money up the wazoo, cut rates, whatever it is. The point is, the government is usually responsible for bailing out these large financial entities to ideally stabilize the banking sector, to stabilize the overall financial sector. But today, JP Morgan has almost become that savior, referred to as a regular rescuer of banks that are going under. Well, in 2008, JP Morgan realized just how strong they could become when they saw some of their other powerful competition in some major financial distress. And due to that financial distress, JP Morgan absorbed Bear Stearns in 2008, and Washington Mutual in 2009. Bank One was more of a strategic merger back in 2004, and that really set the tone, set the path for them becoming this super high growth, high charged bank going forward. But after this merger, the great financial crisis of 2008 brought out a lot of opportunity that JP Morgan maybe otherwise would not have had. But what does this have to do with anything? We're trying to figure out how companies fared after the government swooped in and bailed them out of a tricky situation. Well, JP Morgan, again, was one of those companies, one of those banks in major financial distress on the verge of collapse. They acquire Bear Stearns, Washington Mutual, and with the help of the US government giving them a lump sum of money. And that was the last key that JP Morgan needed to become the Robin to the US government's Batman, the regular rescuer of banks. As we just saw recently with First Republic, the banking crisis of 2023, First Republic went under. JP Morgan absorbed their clientele, their assets that were available, and took on any financial liabilities that First Republic still had. The point is now, instead of the US government stepping in and bailing out this failing company, JP Morgan, now the guardian of our financial system, steps in and saves the day. How does that relate to what we've seen with MP Materials and Intel? Well, today, obviously, there's no problems as drastic as, the auto industry and the entire financial system collapsing like in 2008, or Lockheed on the verge of going bankrupt in 1970. But today, yeah, sure, these are struggling companies, but a far cry from financial distress like we just talked about. This is setting the tone for more active policy going forward. Maybe now, instead of a company failing, a company in major financial distress, the US government can play its hand and invest in really any company it wants, right? And so why did Big Daddy Trump invest in MP Materials? Well, if you didn't know, there's a lot of rare earth materials that we use in tons of things. Technologies ranging from batteries to semiconductors to ASML manufacturing machines. The point is, demand for rare earth materials has grown and grown, especially as technologies become more and more modern, more and more innovative. And the United States is falling pretty far behind when it comes to having a reliable domestic supply of rare earth metals, with China obviously dominating the market. And as we all know, China and the United States, although Xi Jinping and Mr. Trump seem to get along on camera, they don't always have the, let's just say, the warmest relationship with each other. And so it might make sense to start building out this domestic supply, this reliable supply, so that in case things get hairy down the line, in case tension builds between China and the US in this continued trade war that we're in, the US can make it out alive and their supply won't be completely shut out. That's where MP Materials steps in, a US-based rare earth mining company. And so your next question would be, well, what's the deal with Intel? Well, similarly to rare earth materials, chips are the way of the future. Everything we do today relies on chips in some form or another, whether you use the cloud, whether you use your local drive on your computer, whether you use your smartphone, whatever technology you're using, you rely on semiconductor technology, and the Americas aren't exactly faring well when it comes to market share of semiconductors. Another instance of China having a major market share, and we all know Taiwan, TSM, that really dominate the AI chip manufacturing sector. Now again, Lockheed Martin was bailed out of panic. The major auto companies, the major banks bailed out of panic during the great financial crisis. But in 2025, we have MP Materials, we have Intel, which weren't failing companies per se, definitely not companies with extremely strong financials, but it's not like they were gonna go out of business soon, not on the precipice of collapse, right? Our biggest defense contractor bailed them out. Our biggest banks bailed them out. Now we've shifted to a world of more active policy. Now, the consequences of that are unknown at this point, but at the end of the day, Trump isn't even really giving some of these companies a choice. Trump's plan to impose 100% tariffs on imported semiconductors, basically forcing the largest semiconductor fabrication facilities to be built in the United States, or you know what? The price of the goods that you're shipping to the United States are going to be taxed double. So at this point, I guess it's reasonable. It's a pretty logical decision that the United States government made by investing in companies like Intel and MP Materials. They were lacking a domestic supply of something. They wanted a domestic supply of something. That makes sense. But why in God's name is Nvidia taking a stake in Intel? One could speculate that Mr. Trump may have something to do with this, may be talking to Jensen nice. But we don't speculate here. We look at the data. And also, Jensen's a smart guy. We don't have to make any assumptions about that, but just something to think about. Nvidia, a company that has basically taken the world by storm. $4.3 trillion market cap. To put that into perspective, that market cap is greater than something like 95% of countries on the planet. So yes, Nvidia is doing pretty well for themselves. Why do they have to invest in a company that's been stuck in the mud, a company that hasn't been growing for just about 30 years, 3 decades of basically no returns? Just imagine that. No, this is not a chart of GameStop. It's one of America's most important technology companies. And that's exactly why Nvidia might have made this move. You see, as we briefly alluded to earlier, TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor, is responsible for just about 90% of the AI chip manufacturing industry. So, hypothetically speaking, of course, if China and Taiwan were to ever have a scuffle, and Taiwan were to ever, deprioritize printing AI chips and focus on protecting their people for whatever reason, we could imagine that AI chip manufacturing would come to a pretty screeching halt almost instantaneously. In that case, the whole stock market might be screwed, because we all know the whole world economy relies on AI spending at this point. But the point is, Nvidia and Jensen Huang, they understand this. They know, hey, we need to diversify our suppliers fast, because if things would ever go wrong, we're screwed, they're screwed, everybody's screwed, because everybody relies on Nvidia. And you know what? Intel, you guys have been manufacturing chips for some decades now. You must be pretty good at it. You must understand the market. And the best part about that is Intel doesn't really share a market with Nvidia. They're in the CPU market and the traditional data center server market. We can see here that AMD, one of Nvidia's largest competitors, again, definitely a stretch to call AMD a large competitor, as AMD's worth something like $280 billion and Nvidia's about $4.4 trillion. There's really not much competition, but it is competition nonetheless. And as you can see, Intel has been pretty steadily losing market share to AMD in the last decade or so in terms of the CPU market in totality. So think your laptops, your desktop computers, your phone, your traditional data centers. And as you might imagine, this is pretty interesting to Nvidia. Intel owns 71.2% of the desktop market, nearly 80% of the laptop and traditional server markets. There might be some money to be made here. Maybe we can help out Intel and, share some of the revenue in these different industries. So again, those are the data-driven reasons for Nvidia investing into Intel. It's logical, it's sensible.
So we're taking the next logical step with a historic agreement on science and technology partnerships, and this will create new government, academic, and private sector cooperation in areas such as AI, which is taking over the world. I'm looking at you guys. You're taking over the world, Jensen. I don't know what you're doing here. I hope you're right. All I can say is we both hope you're right.
So after Trump and the U.S. government made their massive investment into Intel, into this once technological beast of a company, to now a company that's just falling behind the fast-moving world of innovation, and then Nvidia and Jensen announcing their strategic stake in Intel just a month or so after, you do have to wonder, was there any coordination on this matter? And why does that set up a particularly dangerous precedent moving forward? The US is a capitalistic economy. And if we look at the definition of capitalism simply from Google, an economic and political system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit. So Intel is right here. They are the country's trade and industry. Private owners, well, I'm not sure we would consider the US government a private owner, would we? Now again, there are situations where this is needed, where this makes sense, because if the US government didn't step in and take care of business, then things would go sour really fast for everybody. Not just the company, but the world, people, you. Everything would fall very fast. And that's why there was bailouts of Lockheed Martin, the biggest defense contractor in the 70s. JP Morgan, now the biggest bank in the world by market cap. And we can see that these companies that did receive these bailouts, again, these are cherry-picked examples, I know. But at the end of the day, they seem to have benefited in a pretty grand fashion. Lockheed now getting over 70% of their revenue from the US government. JP Morgan, now the Robin to the United States Batman, in absorbing assets and clientele from failing banks. Now we have the new ones, MP Materials and Intel. Once you have your foot in the government's door, once you start getting those first government provided contracts, those government provided investments, they usually don't stop, or at least the benefits don't stop for a long time. Now, could this end up being anti-competitive? Did the US government just fundamentally change the way that the chip industry, in particular the AI chip industry, is going to operate? No, Nvidia is pretty much already a monopoly there. But the point is, the precedent is now there that a failing company in a particular industry, even if it's not in a crazy high level of financial distress, can receive investment, can receive bailouts. And when you receive that first bailout from the government, you usually continue to reap the benefits. And if you continue to reap benefits from government over the long term, all of a sudden the competition that capitalism runs on, right? The natural hand of the free market all of a sudden becomes a whole lot less competitive and more predetermined as to who's going to come out on top. The US government invested here, and Nvidia invested here. Will these new investments power Intel into a new era, a new age of growth, a revival of a company that hasn't experienced growth in almost 3 decades? I guess we don't know. But if there's any indicators like Lockheed Martin, like JP Morgan, like some other companies out there that have received many benefits from the government over years and years, it seems like benefits might just keep on coming. One other thing on Nvidia, cross collaboration within a team, within just one sector of an organization, especially as large as a company like Nvidia is difficult. Getting people to all work in the same direction towards the same goals on the same projects where their skill sets benefit them the most is a difficult thing to do. And now we're talking about two massive organizations combining to work towards one goal. That's a management HR nightmare. So that's going to be a crazy challenge. But at the end of the day, in conclusion, this bailout shows us that companies that stink and are actively being phased out by competition, as we saw with Intel and AMD, can always be bailed out by the government. All in all, this is just a move by the US to bring manufacturing in domestically for rare earth materials, like with MP Materials, for chip semiconductor manufacturing with Intel, to create not just a reliable supply chain domestically, but to create new jobs in the United States, to create new investment into the United States. Trump wants the American citizen to be wealthy, and to do that, he wants to bring everything to America, and if you don't agree with it, well then you're gonna get a pretty hefty tax for it. Same thing with Nvidia. They want to avoid their sole reliance that they have on TSM right now, just in case, worst case scenario, things get a little sour, a little dicey between Taiwan and China. Also, they want to infiltrate even more avenues with their chips in whatever ways they possibly can, eliminate their competition where they can. And maybe, just maybe, there was a little bit of an influence, a little bit of a sweet talking from Trump. What do you think about the investments from both the US government and Nvidia? More interestingly is Nvidia for sure. I hope you enjoy the video, and I guess I'll see you in the next one. Peace!